Hello and welcome to this webinar hosted by Security Compass. We're very excited to have you all here today. My name is Eleanor Lee, Product Marketing Manager at Security Compass, and your host for today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to address a couple of housekeeping items. First, a recording of this webinar will be available after today's event. You will receive an email with a link to the recording. Second, we encourage everyone to raise questions. Please submit your questions into the chat and we'll collect and address them at the end of the presentation. We'll also open up the audio lines at the end of the presentation for questions. For those of you who may not be aware of us until today, Security Compass started out with a team of very experienced penetration testers in 2004. We have since evolved to become a security software company that offers professional advisory services, training, and SD elements, a first of its kind automation platform that translates security standards to actionable tasks across various software stacks. Our mission is to help customers manage cybersecurity risk without slowing down their business. In today's webinar, we're going to talk about shadow IT. I am thrilled to have here with me Rohit Sethi, COO at Security Compass, and Jeremiah Grossman, founder and CEO at BitDiscovery. I will let them talk about their background. Thank you both for being here. So why don't we dive into the content? I'll let Rohit and Jeremiah take it from here.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. It's pleased to be with Rohit and the rest of you here for this webinar today to share a little bit about what we know and what we've accomplished with our mutual products. So I'm Jeremiah Grossman, founder and CEO of BitDiscovery. In a prior life, I was also the founder of White Hat Security. And one of the things that I found there working in application security for the last 20 years is one of the most common problems that we saw was that the vast majority of organizations didn't know what they had exposed on the internet. They didn't know their websites, their mail servers, DNS servers, any part of their external attack surface if we take an InfoSec lens. So that's the next problem I wanted to work on, because as we like to say, you cannot secure what you don't know you own. So that problem was really, really important to me, because I find that a lot of companies are getting hacked, not only because they don't patch, they may have patched if they knew a particular website existed. And here's where it gets interesting. I'll let Rohit take over. But what I'm excited about is now that we can develop inventories for organizations really quickly, the next step beyond that is using the inventory data to kick off some actionable tasks inside the organization. That's why SD Elements and BitDiscovery are integrating to make this possible.
Great, thanks, Jer. And this is Rohit Sethi, COO at Security Compass. So I've been at Security Compass for 13 years, really focused in application security, and helping people build security into software is our key area of focus. I'm also very excited about this integration. We've had SD Elements for a few years, and we've helped a lot of companies scale out integrating security into the software development process, but we realized that there's a bigger problem, as Jeremiah alluded to, just lack of knowledge of your assets, but orchestrating the work that has to happen and making sure that a consistent series of actions happen for every asset that you do or do not know about is a key problem. And it's something that we'll talk a little bit more, we call the policy to execution gap. So I'll let Jared talk a little bit about shadow IT and take it from there.
Excellent. So let's discuss shadow IT, because it's a very common term in our industry, but we've felt that it deserves definition. So we're just going to read this verbatim here. Shadow IT refers to applications or devices built or used within an organization without the explicit organizational approval. So as they say, the cloud is the easiest way to bypass IT with the swipe of a credit card. So shadow IT is very challenging for general IT teams and InfoSec teams to secure, because we didn't even know the business owned it. We didn't know the business bought it. And that used to be more somewhat okay in years past when the number of these systems was low. But now it's increasing by a large degree, and many of them are becoming business critical all of a sudden without IT or IT security, or even the business really realizing it. So we're going to focus on shadow IT and how we get our arms around this particular problem. So jumping forward here, we wanted to see how big this problem was and try to bring some data to bear. And one of the stats that we came across, I found extremely astonishing. It says here, the 2019 forecast from IDC says the line of business funding technology purposes, including shadow IT projects, will overtake IT funding purchases this year. That means when the business needs something, they'll be equal chance really, but increasingly so, just decide to purchase the system themselves and not go through IT. So if you think about that, I just found that fascinating, that's how the shift is happening. IT and IT security are now going to be mandated in a very large degree to help identify and secure things they had, honestly, no knowledge of, and where the buying criteria or the purchase didn't go through IT. So, that problem is here. It's not coming, it's already here. Now, with that in mind, so there's going to be a big shadow IT challenge, not necessarily a problem, but challenge. And that it's in another stat, Gartner says by 2020, they estimated roughly 1/3 of successful attacks experienced by the enterprise will be on shadow IT resources. And this makes sense because the adversary generally takes the path of least resistance. When you're targeting a system as an adversary, you just want the easiest path forward. And if IT and IT security, their managed assets are looking really good, of course they're going to go after the weaker, easier targets that the line of business purchased on their own.
And this really goes contrary to the way a lot of security programs are being built. With the idea that there is a central security team that is a steward of all assets that come in and do risk assessments and pen testing and a series of activities. But they need to be notified of the new project or new application. And this is really what we see as a struggle for a lot of our clients.
So let's move on to the next one here. So what causes some of this? It's nice to know what gives rise to these sorts of things. The first one is, we'll just go through these briefly. Technology accessibility. These cloud apps are all over the place. They're very easy to stand up. They're very easy to swipe. So the adoption curve, the ease of adoption is coming way, way down. You can buy blogs, marketing websites, swipe on AWS, any number of services out there that you classify as shadow IT. They're just very easy now, which is good for many reasons, difficult for security, but good for productivity. Then over time, end users, the line of business becomes smarter. They get more familiar with these online services. They learn how to click around, navigate, deploy these all on their own with a swipe of a credit card. Then there's IT system limitations. IT and IT departments obviously aren't always the easiest to work with. They're likely much, much slower than a cloud-based system that you purchase. And that follows in the IT organization's lack of agility. So, IT is challenged, it's big, it's monolithic. It doesn't really adapt to the diverse challenges of the business, how fast they want to move and take advantage of a new opportunity. And then finally, the costs of these quote unquote shadow IT services or third-party cloud services are very low. You don't have to wait for IT. They might cost a few tens of dollars, few hundreds of dollars, maybe a couple of $1,000s a year, but it's very low cost. So it makes it a very attractive alternative to stand up these systems all on the business's own and not go through any internal corporate third party.
And it's probably worth pointing out that, security and risk management are two key contributors to that perceived lack of agility from the lines of business, that knowing that they have to go through all the security processes and potentially privacy and compliance versus just buying a product somewhere on the web without having to deal with any of that quote unquote overhead contributes to the concept of agility.
So then what happens? So these things are purchased, they're used by the business or the line of business, their end users, their customers register. What happens over time if it's shadow IT, if the line of business didn't involve IT or the InfoSec team? What happens? For those on this particular call, you're already going to know we're going to miss patches. Maybe the third-party vendor didn't patch, maybe the line of business didn't patch if that's their obligation. There's going to be missing security controls all over the place. Maybe it'll have two-factor authentication. maybe the configs will be right, or any fast detection and response capability might be there, or that should be there isn't. There's going to be vulnerable software components. If you're running struts or whatever the framework is, they're going to install just whatever's given to them, the defaults, and there's going to be vulnerable components that aren't well managed, that aren't upgraded. Uncontrolled data leakage. So if there's sensitive data in the system and it gets compromised or leaked or mishandled somehow, it's going to happen, and the line of business isn't going to know it. The IT team isn't going to know it. And then there's, of course, regulatory non-compliance. If you don't know you own this thing and the business is just using it, and you have certain legal, law, or business contractual obligations, that's just not going to happen either. So it's completely unmanaged, it's all out of control, and it's going to have a very negative impact on overall IT security readiness, which is another reason why Gartner is probably going to be right. Many attacks will shift towards these shadow IT services as the initial beachhead of compromise. All right, so what's the two sides of the story here? The line of business really likes these online services. They're cheap, they're fast, they're easy. Everybody gets out of their way, and IT only sees risks. So we have to kind of give both sides what they need. We have to allow the business to move fast and quickly, and IT needs the ability to manage this risk, to understand it and manage it. And that's what we're gonna help do today.
And we know that if we don't help, which side is going to win there? Which side is going to get their way, right? So it's
the business always wins. Okay, so to sum it up, how are we going to help get our arms around this problem? Very broadly, the first thing we need to do is gain visibility into web assets in the organization. Get an asset inventory of all their web-enabled applications, because that's what we're going to focus on here. Just having inventory isn't enough. We need to be able to kick off a automated series of tasks that are relevant to those assets, that help secure them and bring control, visibility, and increase security on these assets. And then, because these IT environments are not static and the guidance and the tasks aren't static, we're going to be able to repeat this process over and over again. So I'm going to let Rohit take it over from here and describe the integration that we built. And when we get done with that, we're going to show you live what it actually looks like.
Awesome. Thanks, Jer. So let's talk a little bit about how bit discovery and SD elements together can help. So Jer's going to go through how bit discovery works and what it does, and you'll see a live example of it. But at a really high level, it's an asset discovery system. It finds inventories and domains, subdomains, ports, a whole bunch of rich technical information over the entire internet. So not just a specified IP range, but really anything that you own. And then using the API, right now we have a first version of an integration that we will continuously be iterating over say the next couple months. But essentially that integration will allow us to discover or find when bit discovery has found an asset, kick off creating a project in SD Elements, which will look at the technology stack that was described by bit discovery and say there's this prescriptive series of actions that need to be done. And we can differentiate once we learn a little bit more about that application. We can differentiate how you might work with a commercial off-the-shelf application that's a SaaS application versus something that say is custom built, but perhaps not within the realm of IT. And you can essentially tie back to your policy. So if your policies say you have to do a certain series of things, you can use SD Elements to distinguish and determine what does your policy say you have to do for this kind of application. Give a very prescriptive set of security controls, and really have that. Then you could tie that into Jira. You can give it to an individual team to go start working on. Use email notifications. Really, a whole series of things that you can do once that asset has been created in SD Elements. So maybe just to highlight the way we think about the broad problem of what SD Elements does. And this is not going to be sort of a full walkthrough of everything that SD Elements does, but at a high level, we like to ask people, can you consistently track execution of your policy and software? So for example, is your internally developed Java EE web application deployed in Azure following your security policy? Is it following security coding standards? Have you gone through a privacy impact assessment? Have you done static analysis, dynamic analysis, and a component verification scan? And is it compliant with a series of laws, standards, frameworks that apply to just that particular application? Whereas if you contrast that with a commercial off-the-shelf IoT device that's deployed on your internal network, you have a whole series of other things you need to do. Maybe you have to do a vendor security assessment. Maybe you have to configure that device with an internal TLS certificate, change default passwords, minimize personal data retention, do a pen test, and it has to be compliant with a totally different set of standards. Versus an externally developed mobile app that's shipped to customers, and again, a series of things that you need to do and a different set of standards you need to comply with. And so, when we tend to ask customers, you have all of these assets, all these applications, and different kinds of software, both within the internal network and externally. How are you tracking whether you're doing the right things continuously? And this tends to be a pretty big gap, even with a GRC system or IT risk management or, pen testing, static analysis. They might have a series of tools and activities they're doing, but they can't get down to this level of granularity. And really, this is what we call the software policy to execution gap, and this is where breaches happen, right? How can you say with confidence that you know of all you have whether or not they're following the minimum security policy that you define on a continuous basis, not just a once a year painful internal audit process, but on an ongoing basis? And that is the problem that SD Elements is designed to solve. And it does it in a much more scalable way when we have an integration with a bit discovery. So with that being said, I think we're going to move into the demo. So bear with me 1 minute and I will get that set up and hand it over to Jared to talk.
Excellent. So while Rohit sets this up, what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick 5-minute run through of bit discovery to show how it works, the normal use case that a user might experience. To make sure we're clear, everything that we do here is asset inventory for internet connected systems, things that are on the internet, so nothing internal. We're going to focus on things that are publicly available. And the way we start this process, so to overly simplify, you log into bit discovery and you're greeted with a search box, or an ad box, I should say. Because what makes bit discovery different than other tools is that we have a ready set of an enormous volume of internet data. So what you're really doing to create an inventory is not doing live on-demand scanning. You're actually just creating your inventory, using more or less a copy of the internet. So the way we're going to start this here, we're just going to pick an organization. We just, Rohit and I decided that the UN was a good target because, again, we're just dealing with completely public information. You type in the domain name of an organization. It could be any organization in the world, and we'll hit add domain, and it becomes now part of your inventory. So every domain name that you want to enter goes into the left-hand column, and often enough, organizations will not only not know their assets or the websites that are exposed to the internet, they won't know their domain names as well. Bit Discovery decides to help, has a feature that says, if you're interested in something like UN.org, you might also be interested in 18 other domain names because they seem to have the same owner. So we can add those domains here. Now, for most organizations, this little two-step process probably already gets you to better than 80 to 90% of your inventory. You should still, keep a lookout or find what other domain names or IP ranges the organization might own and load this in here too, but this gets us pretty far down the process. So if you notice here, under UN.org, there's 1,662 other assets. So what's an asset? It's a host name or an IP address where you connect to something online. It's a very loose description of an asset online, but that's generally the way it works. Now, you have all these assets that you can click through here. You can go into a particular one and say, I want to learn more about this particular asset and see its demographic data. You can see, domain name, IP records, a whole bunch of metadata, the time zone, mapping information, all sorts of metadata, including the technology stack, which will then be leveraged by SD Elements. Share this, it's running Debian, Apache, and so on and so forth. So depending on what we're able to collect from the asset, it gets pretty feature rich. Just a quick snapshot, the types of data that we collect. I'm going to show you the interface here for the columns of all the data we try to collect. HTTP response data, TLS certificate data, geo data, technology stack data. Some assets will have more metadata than others, but we do the best job we possibly can to find everything. Now that we have this large body of data, we need to be able to slice and dice it to find the types of information that we want. So I'm going to show you two types of filters. Let's just say, for instance, we're interested in TLS expiration, which seems to be pretty popular these days. I want to know everything that has a TLS expired certificate. So I add that filter and they'll pop up just that fast. So there's 18 here that look to have expired TLS certificates, and we could then slice and dice and look at the data different ways. But what we want to focus on here is just the web-enabled assets, because then we're going to point that towards SD elements. So we're going to add a filter and say we're just purely interested in the assets that are web-enabled. So we're going to do ports 80 and 443. So we're going to add the port 80. We're going to add another filter for 443. There we go. And then we're going to say it matches all filters. Now this here, 598, is more or less a rather complete look at the web-enabled presence of UN.org or the organization. What we're going to do next is we can select some of these if we want to and create a static folder out of it, or we can create a smart folder so it's live all the time. So what you do here is you just hit the save button. You say web-enabled assets or any name that we want. And we create a smart folder, just like you might see in an email inbox. And in this folder list over here, you'll see web-enabled assets, and it ends up being a living list. So anytime there's an update made, a new asset came up that we found, you then get an alert. And you can also design yourself alerts that will integrate into email, to Slack, ServiceNow, and the like. But what we're going to focus on here is the integration between SD elements. So the way SD elements integrates with BitDiscovery is via API. So under your profile page, there's a link for full API documentation. BitDiscovery can be completely driven by API. There's really nothing you can't do in the API that you can do in the interface. There's feature parity. So everything is here, well documented. Click butt around to actually, excuse me, to actually use it. So that's very quick run through of BitDiscovery and just one very particular use case, the finding of web-enabled assets. From here, I'm going to let Rohit take over and show you how you then take this data and make it into actionable tasks for the organization.
Great, thanks, Jared. All right, so I've gone ahead and run the integration already previous to this on UN.org. And so we've basically taken all of the assets that BitDiscovery found, and we've created projects in SD elements. Again, this is just publicly available information. Whatever data we can find, we use that to create a particular application in SD elements. And so inside of that application, what we can do is we can say, we want a really lightweight number of things that we want to orchestrate as a result of discovering this asset. Like maybe there's 2 or 3 key things that we want to do on any internet-facing asset. Now, once we find out more about that particular asset, that might start to unlock another series of things to do. So for example, we could say by default, we want you to review and complete the SD elements survey, or we might say perform penetration testing. And there might be a series of things that you need to do, and some basically high-level description of how that works, perhaps some contextual embedded training, and also understanding which standards and regulations completing this task will allow you to work towards compliance on. So if I just sort of start at that high level and I have this set of tasks, assuming I went into that particular application, I could go in and fill out some parts of the survey. So as let's say a security person, I might say, well, I can tell that it's a web-based application and that it is a SaaS application and it is clearly internet accessible. And based on that, it will now automatically classify my application according to my internal standard, right? So for example, we might call this a critical third-party application, and therefore there's a series of things that now I have to start doing, right? So, for example, access control, perform a cloud security posture assessment, and this is just an example list. You would configure this for your organization. We have a series of these activities that we ship out of the box in SD Elements, but it's really simple for you to modify this and make it tailored for your particular organization. Now, the other thing that we can do is every time that one of these tasks comes into play. So let's say, for example, this very first one, which is review application and complete SD Element survey. So since that project was automatically created in SD Elements, we can also use email notifications to let people know, for example, a security architect know that, hey, they have to go in and do this work. So I'll give you an idea of what that looks like. So suppose that I am, I've subscribed to find that task, and it'll come into my inbox. Essentially, it'll look something like this. I will open up my inbox and I'll see, oh, I've been notified that a new task has been added, and it is review application complete SD Element survey for this. And I can click into it, and essentially I can then go back automatically, right into this project, and I can say, yeah, okay, I've done it, I've completed that task, and now there's a series of other things I need to do. Some of those things are manual, some of those things are automated, and so if they're manual, without going into the full demo of SD Elements, I can pick these out and I can integrate them into Jira and go assign them to somebody, right? Or a series of other bug tracking and issue ticketing systems. To the extent that some of them are automated, that's where we can make use of our automation framework. So for example, let's just say that I wanted to integrate with Veracode. And for the sake of the demo, I'm just going to show you a file upload integration, but typically you'd be having a web services integration that would periodically check for the latest status. And so I could say that I want to do a Veracode integration. And what that will do is it'll go into the system, it'll parse the results. Now, if I had secure coding standards, it would do an integration that shows me what security coding standards were followed. In this particular case, since it's a SaaS application, right now we're not looking at secure coding. We're just looking at a series of actions that need to be done. But essentially, it's going to go through that, and then after a couple minutes, give it a second here, it's going to automatically show that, in fact, yes, we performed the DAST tool scan, and that it came back with acceptable results based on whatever criteria we've specified. And in the coming versions, you'll be able to change that criteria, as well as specify that now you need to check every 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. And so this becomes a live dashboard. You've discovered an application, you've determined that you need to do a series of things, and now you're checking to make sure that they're always done. And this gets this idea of continuously compliant and secure, right? We know all of the things we need to do. Now, one thing that is really important to talk about is that's for a third-party application use case. Of course, if it is a custom application where you have access to source code, that's where you can get into the really rich functionality of SD Elements and the secure coding use case. And so without going into all of that workflow, because that's a separate demo, you'll see that this has come to a high-risk in-house application classification, and therefore the series of things that I need to do now includes security user stories. So, for example, secure the password reset mechanism, validate session IDs, very technical controls that stem from our high-level security policy, but that are very concrete and actionable. And to the extent that we know what programming language it is, we can have code samples, we can have more just-in-time training and education, and again, we can configure this to integrate with the Jira. Plus, all of these things can be tailored to the particular organization. So you can create new standards, you can remove the ones that we have out of the box, you can create new rules, new questions on the survey, and make it really sort of flexible and configurable. So I'll stop there. And Jared, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add before we hand it off to questions.
No, as I guess as many can empathize with, there's a lot, like as Rohit went through, there's lots of potential tasks that can be attributed to an asset that are always hard to think of. It's hard to list out. So this is what was really cool, which was why I've been working with Rohit for the last several years on this technology. It's just having a very simple, streamlined way of creating a checklist for an asset. And this is exactly what SD Elements has developed. You take a set of inventory, you generate a set of tasks that are relevant to the particular asset, and you start working on those assets. We start bringing more of an assembly line science to application security rather than spot checking. It's exactly what organizations need to rationalize their entire application security portfolio and process. And personally, I couldn't be prouder and more excited to be working with SD Elements and helping solve this problem.
And yeah, very much likewise, Jeremiah. And to keep this in mind, we did a sample integration here where we put in about 162 applications that BitDiscovery found, and really now we've defined what's the minimum compliance standard for all of those. And so you could go into this, and you can even go business unit by business unit and see progress of who's in compliance and who's out of compliance with the minimum policies that your organization has defined. So really taking it from single asset, aggregating it all together, and getting this global view of where you have potential risks, and really now you're becoming proactive. A lot of sort of governance risk compliance is reactive. You're uploading testing results and internal audit findings. Now you're talking about right from the start, as soon as you discover an asset or you create an application, that you're integrating security and compliance in, and that you're tracking to make sure that you're making progress.
Yeah, so with that, if the attendees have questions, Rohit and I are ready to answer them.
Yes.
Yeah, we received a couple of questions through chat. So I'll start with the first one. How often is the inventory asset data updated?
Sure. At the very least, all asset inventory data, including metadata, is updated no more than every 30 days. Different data sets. So let me take a step back. BitDiscovery itself self-generates from the internet a massive amount of data on its own. And then we also have data relationships with several hundred other third parties to augment our own. There's actually no way any one entity could self-generate all the data necessary. And so different types of data will come in daily. New DNS data will come every day or every other day. Same with WHOIS data. Some data is a little bit slower than that depending on how we collect it. But at most, your inventory will be at most 30 days out of date, which is night and day between what most organizations have now.
Great. We've got another question here. What about monitoring for employees that use third-party cloud portals that aren't associated to one's corporate domain, i.e. Box, Salesforce, etc.?
That's a very big challenge and the right question. I don't think we have a good answer to that one. This is more closer to mission critical services that the business is actually using that we can detect. If somebody just registered with a Box or a Dropbox account or a Salesforce account, and we can't really associate it to the organization, then we obviously won't find that particular asset. This is more for the ones that we can identify as somewhat being owned by the organization, either by logo, domain name, WHOIS registration, IP range, and things like that.
Okay, another question from the audience. How comprehensive are your lists of tasks?
So good question. The library in SD Elements is quite extensive. There's over 1,000 different tasks that we have, based on different technology profiles. So we have kind of 3 categories of what we call tasks in SD Elements. And you can think of a task as a double click on a control. So when you're thinking in kind of compliance or information security policy speak, you might talk about a control activity, and that's usually high level. For example, make sure you use secure coding methods. Whereas in SD Elements, it's a very prescriptive set of actionable things that people need to do, and that's a task. And so those tasks vary by technology stack. We have process tasks, which are activities that you need to do, and those are new in the latest version of SD Elements. There are secure coding or development tasks, which are really things you have to embed inside of an application as you develop it, so you can shift security left and build secure apps right from the start. And then there are deployment tasks. So That includes, locking down the infrastructure around an application, such as if you're on AWS, what hardening steps do you need to do?
Great. Oh, we're getting a lot of questions from the audience. So does the process involve dealing with false positives?
So that's a good question. The integration that I showed with like static analysis and dynamic analysis typically would be post removing false positives. You could, of course, just create a task first that says remove false positives and then provide description. So one of the things I want to make sure is clear is part of the value of a product like SD Elements is the contextual education piece. So you can give people guidance on what they need to do. And a lot of that we ship out of the box, but to the extent that there are things that you want to add, you can add that. So how does somebody go about identifying false positives before you have the integration?
Okay, and does the purchase of SD Element include bit discovery?
So SD Elements is licensed separately from bit discovery, so it does not include bit discovery. We are in the process of working together on an agreement so that you can get it from both of us at the same time. But if you want to jump immediately on this, it would be two separate purchases.
Okay.
Any other questions? Oh, right. So I'm going to go back to the slides. 1 minute here. So this is just a little about us and contact information. So feel free to reach out. And Jared, if you want to talk about how they can reach out to Bit Discovery if they have any other questions.
Absolutely. Very similar for Bit Discovery. Just go to bitdiscovery.com. All our contact information is there. If you want to take a look at the product and get a live demo on your inventory, based, very similar to what I did on the webinar here, we're ready to take your call. We've been showing around to a lot of people, and we live by feedback. We really want to show it off because our desire, our vision is we want every organization out there that wants an asset inventory to have one. It's time we got to that particular point, and we want to help do that.
Sounds good.
Rohit, Jeremiah, thank you very much for a very great session on Shadow IT. Again, we will provide a link to the recording of this webinar to everyone here via email. Don't forget to join us in about 3 weeks on October 22nd for another interesting session on modernizing risk assessments to support your business's DevOps. To register, please visit the resources page on our website at securitycompass.com. Thank you once again to everyone for attending with this webinar. We hope you enjoyed it and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.